What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Gods, and this comic is going to give us a crazy revelation, and I'm curious to see whether or not you guys are going to be able to pick it up. But what this does here is this picks up with the House of Ranks and Numbers, right? Home of the Centum. Now, for those of you guys who missed our last video, we will have a link at the end of this for the Gods playlist so you can get caught up. Fortunately, there's only one video you have to watch. But what's going on here is Hickman introduced us to two new groups, the powers that be and the natural order of things. And what we have here with the natural order of things is these are exactly what you would expect: structure, organization, hence the reason for the House of Ranks and Numbers. But what we saw in the last video is we got this guy who just kind of appeared out of nowhere and just started attacking everybody, right? Just going nuts. During that whole conflict, half of the entire group of the Centum were wiped out, that there were 100 of them in total, and that only 50 remain. And of those 50, there were only 25 who were high-ranking members that are left. And so they have this kind of discussion where the leader of the Centum literally says, like, I've spoken with God, they are not pleased, not since the natural order of things negotiated our current compact and retreated from the battlefield of reality has the Centum found itself in such a fragile state. Now, that's one of the things to understand when it comes to Hickman's God series. This is not like an Avengers comic or anything like that. It doesn't deal with Earthbound stuff. It's much bigger than that. This is a story that focuses on gods, cosmic entities, all kinds of stuff, right? It's much, much grander in scope than anything that we've really seen before. So that's one of the reasons why it's such an exciting thing. What you have here as they're talking is they come to this rational conclusion. The first step is to basically regain more members of their ranks. It's to basically remarshal their forces. And that's like one of the first rules of battle, right? You go into a battle, you lose some men, you have to replenish your forces and then go back into battle again. One of the things that happens here is that Mako, or Mako, however you pronounce her name, one of the girls and one of the members of the Centum that was introduced to us in the last video, she actually questions the legitimacy of God, right? She says, are we really still married to using the word God, quote unquote, especially when we know that omniscience and omnipotence are just super consciousness scaling in tandem with an ever-expanding universe. Now that is hugely important here. And the reason for that is because in years past in Marvel Comics, when it came to like the depictions of cosmic entities, Galactus or Infinity or Eternity or something along those lines, Marvel would just kind of chalk them up to these beings that seemingly know everything that's going on because of the role they have or because they have a grand level of power. But when you look at something like cosmic awareness, it's nothing more than just granting a person a level of intelligence that allows them to see everything that's happening in the universe at the same time. That's how they see it, right? The Centum are more based on logic, reason, and science. And so that's why looking at this idea of God is simply just a person or a group of people that can understand everything that's going on because the level of their intelligence expands to include everything going on in the universe. But what ends up happening here is God physically manifests through the leader of the Centum, right? We see many events, other Babylons, other Sumers. We see blood and chaos and the end of all things. We see the hand of oblivion, and we see you, weak and wanting. With those who must not be named, we share the great compact, and now on this day and in this age, those words are a comfort to you. Gather strength, gather numbers, gather minions. Now, the direct allusion to Oblivion is huge because for those of you guys who don't know, Oblivion is a cosmic entity in Marvel Comics that exists one part in fan interpretation and one part in terms of how he's been depicted. The fan interpretation of Oblivion outside of the Quasar series, which was recently launched, is that Oblivion is a cosmic entity that represents simply the absence of anything in existence. And by that very nature, it transcends everything, right? If like the one above all was killed, Oblivion would still continue to live on because it represents the absence of life, right? The space between the birth and death of the multiverse and its rebirth in whatever form it takes. The reality here, and really when you look at Marvel Comics, we don't know much about Oblivion because he never shows up. He hardly ever appears in Marvel Comics. And when he does, he's very cloak and dagger in terms of how he talks. And so while you will see discussions on the internet that like Oblivion is the most powerful cosmic entity in all of existence, the reality here is they don't really know what they're talking about. And it's not to say that as an insult, it's simply to say that like Marvel has not clearly established what Oblivion stands for and what Oblivion is about, so we can't accurately do it. But with God appearing and then speaking to them, the response of everybody is, okay, cool, so it's legit. Let's just go forward from here. And so what you end up doing is transitioning to Doctor Strange alongside Wynn and those guys. Now again, Wynn was introduced to us in the very first issue of Gods, and for those of you guys who are familiar with DC Comics, he's very much a Marvel version of like John Constantine, to be quite honest with you guys. And so one of the things that goes on here is they have this kind of discussion where Doctor Strange says that with everything that's happened, we simply need to have a delving. And for the most part, everybody's on board. Clea, Jericho Drum, also known as Brother Voodoo, like Wynn, all these guys are kind of like, sure, right? So it's really kind of them using a source of knowledge that they already have. Although it's being introduced to us as the comic book reader for the first time, because we've never really heard of a delving in Marvel Comics before. But what ends up happening is that Doctor Strange summons Kubisk Core, right? This was the guy that launched the attack in the last issue that we had, and seemingly was able to wipe out most of the Centum, and in fact, even give Doctor Strange and those guys a run for his money. This guy had an astronomical amount of power. But when Kubisk Core shows himself, what he says here is, we need to wake up. We need to stop this slumber, and for the dream to end, we need the box. Now, as soon as this guy says, like, the box, that's when Doctor Strange is like, oh my God, right? And Wynn's like, are we really gonna follow this path? Clea bails. She's just like, I'm not gonna have any part of this, right? Jericho Drum's like, I've got other engagements to attend to, and Wong's just like, yeah, man, I'm out. Nobody wants to have anything to do with whatever this box is. And it makes sense because we'll find out here in a second, and the box is amazing. But before we do, what we actually end up doing here is switching over to Columbia University with a girl named Mia. Now, she will become important later on as we get closer towards the end of this story, but one of the first big clues in terms of what Hickman's doing with regards to gods comes in the form of a piece of paper that Mako gives to Mia. And this is simply just 808.616. Now 616, most of you guys can figure out right off the bat, that's the numerical designation for the main Marvel universe. It's been that way ever since the old Captain Britain comics, when Marvel first started assigning numerical designations to different universes. 808 is an alternate reality story. And I was like mind blown when Hickman decided to include this. That's a what if story where Doctor Doom became a good guy, where he became a superhero. He never became a villain, right? So that's our first clue. Now, what goes on with Mia is that she basically ends up taking off, she goes to hang out with her friends, that kind of stuff, and you get this kind of indication for her as a character that she largely just kind of seems to be lost to a degree, right? She's going through this task, she's going through these roles, she's living her life as she's supposed to live it, right? Societal expectations and so on and so forth, but she feels like she was meant for something better, right? So that's going to be an important theme as we get through this. But jumping back to Doctor Strange, he basically ends up using his power on Kubisk Core, and then what he does is he says, for the most part, whatever it was that happened to him, his mind was reduced to that of a child. But every child has a universal drive to return home. They always know where home is. And so Kubisk Core takes them there. And what they end up doing is actually arriving in a warehouse out in Athens, Georgia, nowhere significant, but then they end up coming across the box. And quite literally, Kubisk Core just kind of reverts into this exceedingly terrified childlike state where he keeps referring to the box as home. And so what ends up happening here is that Wynn kind of chimes in and says, well, like, I guess this confirms what kind of situation we're dealing with here. And Stephen Strange says, I've never actually seen one of these before. But when Wynn asks, you know what this is? Stephen Strange's response is, yes. And he says, and you know who it belongs to. Stephen Strange says, yes, again, right? And that's when Dimitri, who's kind of like the source of information for everything, chimes in. And what we end up finding out is that this is a Skinner box. In effect, this box is used on higher level cosmic entities and practitioners of magic, right? Incredibly powerful people to effectively recondition them. What we end up finding out here is Kubisk Core, that's not actually who he is. This is the in-betweener who's been reconditioned and his mind has been warped and completely changed. And in fact, we'll find out who it was that did it here in a second. And you may not realize who it is right off the bat, but I will tell you who it is because I'm not going to leave you hanging. So this is kind of mind-blowing because for those of you guys who don't understand what goes on with the in-betweener, within the Marvel cosmic landscape, right, when it comes to cosmic entities, you've got eternity, infinity, and Galactus, and so on and so forth, celestials, all that. Then you have Master Order and Lord Chaos. Now these guys, of course, as you would expect, represent opposing factions, right? Order and chaos. But in order to provide a kind of neutral ground, they have an avatar of sorts that sort of operates on their behalf, which is the in-betweener. He's a cosmic entity that represents both order and chaos. He usually does the bidding of Master Order and Lord Chaos, but sometimes he goes off and does his own thing. But this guy's astronomically powerful, which means whatever force was able to recondition the mind of a cosmic entity, break it down, restructure it, and turn him into something else, essentially brainwashing him, it has to be an incredibly powerful being. And what we end up finding out here, bro, this is crazy. What we end up finding out here, right? That while In-Betweener was listening to what like Doctor Strange and them were saying, it's just kind of speaking into the void, right? Is it true? Am I lost? Are they right? This voice comes out of nowhere and says, of course not, my love. How could they be right? They are out there and you are in here. Now, if you guys notice, the text bubbles are blue. What story did we cover recently that had a character that operated on a cosmic scale that had blue text bubbles? That's the question. If you've been following the channel, you know exactly who that is. I would bet all the money in my pockets to all the money in your pockets, it's the Beyonder. It's the only thing that makes sense of being out there so incredibly powerful, because at the end of Defenders Beyond, the Beyonder just took off. That was it. It was just like, I'm done, right? It just left and did its own thing. So we don't know what's going on in Marvel Comics with the Beyonder. And if Hickman's reworking and restructuring everything, it's entirely possible that whatever forces exist out there, the Beyonder has either been conscripted or has voluntarily chose to join them in their cause and is helping to recondition the minds of cosmic entities, because it makes perfect sense. Lest we forget, like, this is what we're dealing with here, right? Like from the previews and the backup stories for Gods, right? When it was appearing in other comic books, people are like smuggling cosmic cubes to the corpses of cosmic entities. It's crazy the kind of stuff that's going on here, right? And so what you end up doing is picking back up with Mia, who's kind of come to this revelation that for the most part, she is just kind of curious about this information that was given to her by Mako, right? There's this kind of little slip of paper. So she goes back to the library that she works in, or at least that she studies in. And when she gets there, she goes looking for the code that's assigned to this particular book. When she gets there, she comes across a book that's titled The Lost Years of Yabat Uman Turu, right? The Failed History of the Black Swan, a book of the Black Priests. Now, those of you guys who have read Jonathan Hickman or who saw our coverage of Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, that's the original Black Swan from that story. That's who she is. It's the lost tales of her character, right? It's a book by the Black Priest. If you guys recall, during Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, when the multiverse was collapsing and everything was ending, the Black Priests were kind of like the multiverse's own antibody system, right? Like literally, the Black Priests were just the multiverse creating these beings out of nowhere. Doctor Strange eventually took them over and then was able to use the words of the Black Priest, which made him ridiculously OP. But the fact remains here that like, this is what we're dealing with. This is one of the reasons why I love Jonathan Hickman writing, because everything feeds into everything else. It's why I always told you guys, Hickman is largely self-contained, right? You can read Fantastic Four, then you read S.H.I.E.L.D., then you read Secret Warriors, you read Avengers and New Avengers, then you read this, and it all just kind of ties in together on its own. It's awesome, right? We have a whole Jonathan Hickman playlist, right? Go check it out at the end of this video. It's awesome. But Mako ends up approaching Mia. And what she does is she literally tells her, and it's a really cool conversation here. We won't go through all of it, but it's really cool. Because as the two of them are talking, Mia's skeptical about all of this. Because in reality, the idea of like a woman appearing out of nowhere and really kind of giving like the Nick Fury speech from Iron Man 1, right? Like, you know, you're part of a much bigger universe. You just don't know it yet, like that kind of a thing. It's hard for the average person to accept as being real, right? It would be like if some random person just showed up on your doorstep, you know, and was just like, you know, you're a wizard, such and such, you would think they were crazy. But like literally what ends up happening is that when the book is pulled down, it opens the gateway from this library into the Library of Worlds. Now, like we mentioned in the last video, The Library of Worlds is a place that sits at kind of a nexus point for the multiverse. You can enter into any universe from the Library of Worlds. But historically speaking, the Library of Worlds had been abandoned, right? It was one of the first places attacked by the Black Priests and the Ivory Kings, right? The Beyonders during Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers run. So it's one of these things where it's kind of like it had been abandoned for eons, right? Eons and eons and eons. If anything, it was treated as like a safe refuge, but like that was it. Right? And so for the most part, it's kind of reproliferated. It's come back. There are people from different places across the multiverse that use it now. There's all kinds of knowledge of magic, like reality warping, crazy levels of power, anything you could ever want to know about the multiverse and the powers that are contained within can be found in this Library of Worlds. And if you are a person who is knowledgeable in practicing magic and say you had no moral reservations whatsoever, all you wanted to do was just achieve the highest level of power possible, you could do that here, which is one of the reasons why the Library of Worlds is only revealed to certain people. Because if the wrong person got inside this library and gained access to all the information in this place, they would be able to destroy the one above all, conquer all of existence, and just make it their own. And nobody could stop them, right? It'd be a horrifying situation. And so what ends up happening is that Maki, I've been calling her Mako this time, I'm sorry guys, Maki ends up talking to Mia and literally kind of spills the beans on all of this, right? And says, look, here's the thing, right? The life in which you live is not the life that you were meant to live. Right? The reality here is that most people in this world live the life that they're supposed to live for no other reason than just like expectations, familial expectations, job expectations, so on and so forth, right? But you are in a very unique circumstance where the shackles of societal structures do not apply to you. You can do what you want, when you want, how you want, and you can leave this structured and organized world behind. And so what I want to do is for you to practice all of this, and I simply want to observe. Now, Mia takes this in a very, very rough way because in her mind, she sees this as though she would just be some kind of observable experiment, right? Like a gerbil in a hamster wheel. And so initially, she rejects it. Despite how fascinating it all is, and despite how interesting all of this is, she doesn't want to be some kind of a pet project. But I would go so far as to argue that even on a much deeper level, she's rejecting the reality of this because there's a level of discomfort to it. It flies in the face of the entire life she lived and everything she knows. Right? And that's kind of the thing. As human beings, like we pursue comfort, right? We are creatures of habit. If we can predict tomorrow, we know everything will be okay. But when tomorrow becomes unpredictable, we don't really know how to function, right? We kind of break down and we feel like we lose control of our lives in this situation. And so what Maki is arguing here is let yourself feel like you don't have control. And in doing that, it'll be the first time you actually have control. Because at that point, your life stops becoming a linear path and it becomes a future full of unlimited options, right? And that can be terrifying. And so what's really cool about this is that once she leaves, she goes back to her friends and she's hanging out with her friends. But being exposed to this life, nothing's ever the same anymore, right? It's Eve partaking of the tree, right? The apple from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. There is no going back. You cannot unring that bell, right? She knows what things could look like now. And because of that, everything else just seems boring, right? It just seems mundane, right? It just kind of seems like these people living this path. And a really cool example of this is when she's just kind of laying in bed. She's just sitting there thinking over her life. And she's just like, no, she has to go back. And so she does. And that's where Maki's just kind of like, I knew you would return. I knew you would come back here. Because the possibility of what you could be and the possibility of what life could become is just something you can't walk away from, right? The curiosity inevitably got the better of you. And so literally she kind of challenges her a little bit, and it's like, is this something that you feel like you're up to, or are you going to give up? Right. And that's where, Mia kind of ties more into like the personal drive to like improve, refusing to give up, so on and so forth. And she ultimately joins Maki, becoming a newer member of the Centum. I would argue, though, that what's really going to happen here is she's going to become a major player within the sphere of gods, because Hickman as a writer very rarely ever focuses so heavily on a particular character in a story only to ignore them later on down the line. Patience with Hickman is key, and so she may not be relevant until we get towards the end of the story, but she will likely end up becoming incredibly important. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. If you want to get caught up on everything related to Jonathan Hickman, Fantastic Four, Avengers and New Avengers, the whole 9 yards, make sure you guys click this link to the playlist, and I will catch you all later. Peace.